Welcome to ProCast, a podcast hosted by the Office of Public Procurement Policy, where we discuss critical issues shaping the procurement landscape in Jamaica. Today, we're diving into a critical issue, risk in public procurement. Risk is real and the stakes are high. To dissect this complex issue of risk in public procurement, we're thrilled to be joined by Mr. Andrei Bennett. Andrei Bennett is an attorney at law. He is the Chief Public Procurement Policy Officer in the Office of Public Procurement Policy in the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, with the mandate to achieve the objectives of Jamaica's public procurement regime. He holds a Bachelor of Laws degree in Public Procurement Law and Strategy from Bangor University in the United Kingdom, a legal education certificate from the Norman Manley Law School, the Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of London, Bachelor of Sciences degree in Pure Chemistry from the University of the West Indies, Mona, and he is a certified International Risk Manager, a designation from the Chartered Institute of Bankers in Scotland. Andrei is also an adjunct lecturer at Bangor University, where he lectures in international procurement law, and at the University of the West Indies, Mona, where he lectures in procurement law and policy and strategic sourcing. In his spare time, he also plays the violin and piano. He is an avid reader and a fitness enthusiast. Andrei is also an active member of the Bethel Gospel Assembly, where he is involved in the ministry of the church and outreach to the surrounding community. Welcome to the podcast, Andrei. We're very happy to have you join and discuss this very topical issue with us.
Thank you, Samaria.
Okay, you're welcome. Andrei, to begin, how do you define risk in public procurement, and how does it differ from general uncertainty or unpredictability in government operations?
Great. So I think to have a good discussion about risk in public procurement, it's useful to have an understanding of what risk is. So loosely, risk is the probability of an event happening that will derail your objective. So you set out to do something, the risk that occurs may cause you not to achieve the thing you've set out. That's a very loose way of putting it. More formally, risk is really a combination of exposures and uncertainties. And there's an exposure and there's an uncertainty that the two of them come together, they intersect, and that causes your objectives to now be derailed. And it's important to understand it in that context, because we need to break down this whole idea of certainty versus uncertainty. So let me ask you this question. If a man or a woman, one time now, if a man is flying in an airplane and he jumps out of the airplane without a parachute, does he face any risk?
Yes, he does.
No, he doesn't, because he's certain to die. I mean, unless he's going to land on a haystack the size of Texas, and even then, that's probably not going to help him. There is a certainty about what's going to result from that action. That's not what we're talking about. So there are a number of bad things that can happen. Some of them you're certain about. Others are uncertain. Risk thrives in that area of uncertainty. It's all about the uncertainty of future outcomes. All right? So it's necessary for us to think, therefore, about the things that you're sure are going to happen and the things that you're not sure about. We use risk to analyze those things that we're not sure about. And risk thinking, therefore, manages those things. And then we talk about exposures. It's not a risk if you're not exposed to it, right? There are a number of things that can happen to me in Montego Bay. Yes, I know you come from Bay, right? But I am not now in Montego Bay.
Okay.
Therefore, I need not concern myself with all the possible things that could happen in Montego Bay. I most likely need to concern myself with the things that might happen in this room, in this interview. Risk comes to answer those questions. So there's an exposure and there's an uncertainty. And the two of them together help you to understand what risk is. Okay, so what is procurement risk then? Procurement risk describes, and we can wax philosophical about it, but at the core, if we're going to use the heuristic from before, is procurement risk is an estimation of bad things that could derail procurement objectives according to the objectives that are set out by the system that you're procuring in. So apart from the risk in the acquisition itself, there might be risks associated in the process of acquiring the subject matter, right? So you could have legal risks because procurement is governed by law. You could have economic risks that are sort of arise because of market operations. You could have financial risks because the thing that finances the procurement contract is money. So you could have a number of different streams of risk that come to affect public procurement. And so you ask, well, how is it distinguished from other government operations? Is that in a lot of ways, and maybe more so than any other process in government, public procurement is multidisciplinary. And so it's informed by a number of considerations and therefore subject to a greater number of uncertainties and exposures. So another thing I need to mention is that, quite apart from the analysis of uncertainties and exposures, risk is really about measurable uncertainty. So it's being able to identify the things that, and to quantify the sort of extent of that exposure. It's not just willy-nilly looking at threats or possibilities. So all uncertainties are not risks, but all risks are uncertainties. What converts them is their ability to measure them. So it's like if I said to you, there's a jar of black and red sweeties on the table. I said, what's the probability of pulling a black sweetie? You might say 1 in 2, 1 in 5, 1 in 17. You don't know. But if I gave you the opportunity to look in that jar, maybe to even count out all the black and all the red sweeties, and then I said to you, what's the probability of pulling a red sweet? Then you would better be able to estimate the probability. Risk is that sort of thing. It's being able to measure that uncertainty, right? And that's very critical so that it distinguishes it from any other kind of prediction or future prediction. And that's therefore important when it comes to the procedures that we will probably discuss around how to actually manage the particular risk. Because in identifying it, it needs to be something that you can actually measure. That's what I would say is risk as a definition. So to that extent, I would say public procurement is probably one of the more risky things in government.
Indeed, that's a very wholesome definition and contextualization of risk. So you touched on various disciplines that impact our understanding of risk. What insights or how can insights from other disciplines enhance how we assess and respond to procurement risks?
Yeah, so pretty much there's a good story by an author called Althos. I forget her first name now, but I can find the resource and send it to you if you're interested. And she argues that pretty much from the point of view of how we come to know things, that's called epistemology, different disciplines have different approaches to understanding and controlling risk. So she argues, for example, that there are a number of quantitative and qualitative ways by which risk may be analyzed. And because procurement is multidisciplinary, therefore helps us to look to see how risk is analyzed in each of these disciplines that affects procurement. So in relation to law, risk is really a function of identifying liabilities. All right. In relation to economics, risk is all about the way the markets affect the undertaking. In relation to business management and operations, which is a stream that affects public procurement, risk is all around impacts on efficiency and how you get things done in a sensible way, and performance, the combination of efficiency and effectiveness. So it's important then in thinking through our different risk projects, we have to identify all components, right? So from a country system level, that's what we do. We look at all of the things because we have these objectives that are informed by these basic things. In doing risk management and analysis in your own organization, you have to break down things into their component parts. And I guess we'll talk about that a bit later.
Sure, we will. Procurement often focuses on the contract phase, but risks indeed occur at earlier phases. What are some of the key pre-contract risks that procurement professionals should watch for?
Yeah, that's a big question, and you're totally right.
Yes.
A lot of what we think about when we think about risk is mostly in the post-contract phase. It's in that phase that affects, sort of deals with the issues on the ground. But there are many decisions that are taken prior to getting to contract that have an impact on the kind of contract that's formed and the respective obligations of the parties and how that eventually wraps up into getting the job done or the project implemented. Let's start at a very, very basic level. Mm-hmm. In relation to value, right? Value for money. One of the things I always tell people about is that value for money is not found in the cheapest thing. It's not necessarily in the cheapest thing, but it's in the thing that is properly specified, that is acquired from a capable supplier, and on the best possible terms. Let's talk about specifications. Now, we know that need analysis is done not usually or not necessarily by the procuring department, but by a department external to the procuring department. So one of the things that is very problematic or could be problematic is that when the specifications for a particular widget come to procurement, or when the work is scoped by a unit outside of procurement, there's the possibility that the thing is not properly specified. And if it's not properly specified, it means that you're going to the market for the wrong thing to begin with.
Right.
And if you go to the market for the wrong thing, you're going to buy the wrong thing.
Exactly.
And if you buy the wrong thing, then you're going to try to implement the wrong thing. At the end of the day, that's going to be a real problem for value for money. So that's one of the examples of a pre-contract decision that needs to be very carefully managed. It's in the needs analysis is how the need is defined. Now, a lot of people don't care about defining need properly.
No.
Because most of our procurement departments, unfortunately, are crisis centers. They are like the situation room. They are given very tall orders to fulfill in a very short space of time. And what's going on outside is pretty much akin to nuclear war.
Nuclear war?
It's pretty much akin to nuclear war.
Okay.
Because if you don't have the right amount of time and resources to properly deal with all of the issues that could affect your procurement, then you're going to just create chaos. Another thing, for example, that you need to think about carefully in pre-contract phases is in defining evaluation criteria in the solicitation phase. So, qualification criteria in particular help the procuring entity to answer questions about the supplier's capacity and capability. Right? Now, if those are not properly thought through, you can have a litany of issues, including forming a contract with a supplier that is entirely incapable of doing what you've asked him to do.
Yes.
Or her, woman time now. So you have to be clear on the kinds of criteria and characteristics that qualify a supplier to do a particular job. Right? If you don't make those good decisions, then that has an impact on the implementation of your contract. You follow me?
Yes. Indeed. So then, can you walk us through a framework for taming risk in the procurement process and explain how it helps procurement entities or procuring entities to become more efficient and more resilient?
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, so, there is a whole category of professionals called risk professionals. And I really do think that some of our procurement activities in our procuring entities could be de-risked, for want of a better word, by leaning into actual professional engagement. I think one of the things that's important is to recognize the impact of these risks on the achievement of our particular goals. But anyway, most people, in terms of risk management, they start too far down. So what they do is that they gather people into a room and they brainstorm and they say, what are some of the risks to the project or to the particular procurement? And then everybody gives an answer. And they say, okay, let us rate the risk. And somebody put a 5, a 4, a 3, a 2, a 1. Then say, all right, let us figure out mitigation strategies. And they figure out a mitigation strategy. And then put it down in our book, in our file 13. Okay. The 3 things that I just mentioned are important. But there are 2 prior ones that I think are necessary. The first thing to do is that if we accept that risks are things that affect our goals, we need to be clear on what our goals are.
Indeed.
Right? We cannot start to have a conversation about risk unless we know the objectives that we're pursuing. Because the risk is the thing that's going to affect the achievement of the objective. So even before trying to come up with a risk register and so on, we need to be clear on what we're actually trying to accomplish. So the first thing I would advocate for is a definition of our goals. Now, from a country system perspective, Parliament has made it very easy for us, as you know, because in our legislation, we have 9 goals that the system pursues. Now, some people argue as to whether these are actually goals or if some of them are goals, but some of them are just supporting to goals.
Adjacent.
A whole lot of philosophical issue. For the time being, we have 9 goals.
Right.
So from a country system perspective, we know the goals we are trying to accomplish. In each acquisition in a procuring entity, it is important that you define the objective that you're actually, or identify the objective that the acquisition is meant to fulfill. And that's sort of basic, right? But many people don't do it. And you could have a number of objectives that are tied to the one acquisition, because you could have an objective related to the primary acquisition, sort of that relates to the subject matter. And then you could have something that's horizontal. So in acquiring the thing, we identified this as a project that could bring benefits to the local community, for example. And so therefore, let us use some kind of technique that includes local communities. Right. All right? So you could have multiple objectives. Anyway, the first thing to do, you must know what you're doing. You must know the objective that you've set out to accomplish. Then the second thing is an analysis now of all of the procedures that affect the attainment of that objective. Right? So in public procurement, you have a number of different steps and stages of decision making. And you want to identify all of them that could possibly affect the attainment of the goal. Then now, remember I said, risk is not all about identifying all the things that could go wrong, right? In a way, it's about measurable uncertainty and an uncertainty to which you're exposed. So, having identified all of the components, all of the things that could affect the goal, then you're going to ask yourself the question, which one of these are we exposed to, really and truly? And you're going to look at historical records, you're going to look at future projections, you're going to look at a number of authoritative sources that help you to form that good impression about which one of these is really problematic, which ones of these are problematic. Follow me so far?
Follow.
Step one, you have to identify the goal.
Right.
You have to know what the thing is risked, what risks are possibly going to affect the achievement of the goal. Then step two is you're going to analyze all of the decisions and processes that affect the attainment of the goal. Then you're going to now look at all of the things that you are actually exposed to, all of the uncertainties that you're exposed to. Then now we can get into that whole ranking and thing that most people do. So you're going to rank them and you're going to say, okay, yeah, this is a big problem on the basis of our experience, on the basis of historical context, etc. This is a serious issue. You rank those, and then finally you would figure out, okay, if this happens, what are we going to do? What would the response be? And that's how you now manage the risk. So if you ask how to tame risk in public procurement, you cannot tame it until you first understand it. You have to understand the risk, and then after you understand the risk, you figure out a strategy to deal with what will happen if the risk incepts.
Okay, if it indeed occurs. And then I hear you speaking of managing the risk with that robust understanding. In your view, what sort of tools can public procurement practitioners deploy to manage the risk more efficiently?
When you say tools to deploy to manage risk, we're talking about the entire scheme of that framework, like from understanding it to strategies to actually deal with
Any
what would incept?
nugget that you feel takes center stage, you can choose.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll answer it from a more comprehensive perspective.
Right.
One of the things that is really, really helpful to practitioners, or can be helpful to practitioners, is relying on data. That's something that we have been focusing a lot on over the last few years in OPPP. Data is so pregnant with possibility, right? It answers so many questions, and it helps you to contextualize a lot of the work that you have to do. How do you get data? Through automated systems. So like your technology systems, your enterprise systems. GoJep, e-procurement yields a lot of data that can help in identifying really and truly what the exposures are. You can look at GoJep data, ask it the right questions, and you can get a good sense of what the exposures are. So for example, well, we have a profile of retenders in Jamaica.
Right.
You know, the office has
Yes.
the PRS, and we know now why people retender, and we have a good trend and pattern. We can look at all that data and sort of identify that there may be correlations between a particular method of procurement and the need to retender. For example, you know, the data gives us that confidence that when we're making decisions, therefore, about managing that particular risk, that we are looking at the right set of considerations. All right? So technology, GoJep, e-procurement, enterprise tools, all necessary, all important, all useful in this process of managing risk.
Good. Contract type. Now, we know that that is a lever in managing procurement risk between buyers and the suppliers. How should you say procuring officers would determine whether to use cost reimbursement, fixed price, what sorts of contracts based on the risk landscape? What's your analysis of that?
Yeah, well, you know, Samoya, the first thing I would say that procurement practitioners need to do is they need to go advise themselves of all the different types of contracts that are available and, possibly used in terms of the standards that commercially attend to public procurement or private procurement for that matter. In Jamaica, we don't have a full playbook of contracts, in all honesty. We have one that deals with a fixed price situation, which I'll come to. Yeah, you have one that deals with time and materials, and then you have one that approximates a cost reimbursable sort of level of effort contract, mostly for like consulting and so on. Anyway, a good rule of thumb, I would say, is that the more uncertain the acquisition, or put another way, if there are uncertainties that attend the acquisition to which you're exposed to, the more risky the acquisition, the more control the procuring entity should have over that risk. The procuring entity should keep the risk, unless there's a good, compelling reason to have the supplier assume that risk. Just as a rule of thumb.
A rule of thumb, okay.
All right. Now, let's start from the easiest one. There is very little risk when all the contract considerations are clearly well defined and the job is nicely and neatly scoped. All right? In those situations, a firm fixed price contract is quite appropriate. That puts all the risk on the supplier. So the supplier now is giving a promise, is making a promise in that contract that regardless of what happens during implementation, this is the money that you are bound to pay. So if things go off the rails, the supplier has to find a way to bring it back on course without the expectation of any more compensation. Right? Now that is in circumstances where the thing is clearly and well defined. But then you have some circumstances where the subject matter is still a little bit uncertain, where the definition of all the components, you think about, a complex acquisition. I can't give an example now. Nuclear things are coming to mind. I don't know why.
Why?
Yeah, but let's say that, we're going to go invest in nuclear technology in Jamaica, right? One of the things that we'd have to do is a whole range of studies around feasibility and then in the actual implementation and startup of that plant, there are many things that might be uncertain about that. So you might want to think about aspects of that implementation, and those things that are uncertain, you let contracts for cost reimbursables. So you identify a core set of prices or a core set of compensable events, right, that the supplier will claim for. And then there are some things now that the supplier may have to go out and get done, including additional studies and so on, in order to ensure that the implementation is safe.
Right.
So when those things happen, the supplier goes into its pocket and says, well, let me acquire the services of this expert, let me do this. Then now the supplier makes a claim on the procuring entity for reimbursables for that spend, those expenses. And then there are times when you might have a contract that is pretty well defined, but the market for this supply is very competitive. And in order to get the best possible outcome, you could control for it through your evaluation criteria and so on, but you could also offer a cost incentive contract, an incentive-based contract. The incentive-based contract now is the contract type that has the supplier finding ways to improve the implementation over and beyond the thing that was actually agreed in the contract. So, except that the framework for the incentives is also agreed, right? So if he comes in, just for argument's sake, earlier than the anticipated time, or if there is some kind of what we call value engineering, where there's a particular aspect of the job that is subject to a certain engineering design in the contract, but the supplier may re-engineer that component and come up with cost savings. How the contract works is that the supplier now keeps some of those cost savings for itself.
Right.
There are incentives to a particular kind of performance. Now, all of that sort of decision is based on your ability, in part, is based on your ability to identify risk. The other part is how much money you have to spend, right? But in terms of dealing with, thinking about risk in the acquisition, yeah, you can use different contract types that will therefore now help you to better achieve the goals that you've set out in terms of the subject matter.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I hear you now speaking of managing the risk, whereas there are many persons who believe that risk should be totally avoided, right? That there's that school of thought in some aspects of the procurement space and otherwise. But is there a case then to be made that embracing certain risks in public procurement indeed drives innovation?
Absolutely. So the people that avoid risk are the people that never accomplish anything.
Right.
A journalist can say, I've never been sued for libel, but the journalist has never broken a story of any consequence or significance. Okay? The people that built the Burj Khalifa or any other kind of architectural marvel or wonder are people that they studied physics and they studied how forces work. And they say, we're going to do something that comes to the point where physics is going to fail.
Let's push the boundaries.
It's pushing boundaries.
Right.
Yeah. You never get anything without taking that kind of risk. So the people that avoid risk entirely, they never go anywhere, they never do anything, they never achieve anything worth mentioning or noting. So I guess you can do that if you want. But that's not what we want.
No.
What we want is a public sector that is within reason and based on risk decisions taken at the right level, are embracing risk, right? Recognizing that, as you say, the reward is great. That's how you're going to find innovation. And there are a number of things that can be innovated on, right? From a procurement practice to a particular implementation in terms of subject matter and scope and specification to procedures. You know, you can innovate a whole range of things, right? We don't want an avoidance of risk. What we want is identification of it and managing it. Well, identification, understanding it, and then management of it. Yeah. So there is a case that the greater the risk, the greater the reward. And we want people to push boundaries. We don't want you to play fast and loose with taxpayer dollars. That's not what I'm talking about. But we do want you to push boundaries and to recognize risk, how it operates, and how it may affect your objective.
Wonderfully said. I hear you speaking now of innovation, how to manage the risk so that we build more resilient systems. That's the thrust of what I'm hearing in that argument. How can procurement systems then reduce barriers for, say, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs, while still protecting public resources? Because that is indeed an area of risk.
Yeah, it's a big topic. And I think that more and more we are called upon to figure out this question. Right. Because we recognize that the size of the public procurement spend is large. 5 billion United States dollars roughly each year. And what we want to do is to ensure that the spend gets to as many people as possible. And especially in that group is the MSMEs. Now, there are a couple of ways in which you can balance inclusion of MSMEs and quality in the implementation. Here's an out-of-the-box one. Why not focus on, maybe a partnership with MIIC or JBDC that empowers MSMEs in relation to their understanding of public procurement systems and what's required of them in public procurement contracts, right? So, in other words, sort of looking at the other side, looking at the supplier side. How about ensuring that things like access to finance, so that when they earn the public procurement contracts, they are able to deliver the contracts efficiently. So, you can increase their access to finance and their understanding of how to finance these procurement contracts. a lot of empowerment, right? That have nothing to do necessarily with nuts and bolts procurement, but it's still important for the overall impact. But then more on the procurement side now, instead of procuring these very large bundles, why not unbundle to smaller contracts? Not splintering to avoid approval tiers, but unbundling large procurements so that you can have smaller suppliers earning those contracts and, ensuring that they are very clearly defined, very clearly scoped. And then in the larger contracts, why not have a big brother, big sister mentorship system? So you could have a case where the contract is let to a large supplier, but one of the stipulations is that that large supplier must partner with a smaller supplier, and for the purpose of transferring knowledge, technology, and so on, until that smaller supplier is now capable of standing on its own in a large contract. There are lots of different things that can be done to include MSMEs while still paying attention to quality. Those, I think, are some of the key ones.
Indeed, wonderfully said as well. So to close on such a riveting and rich discussion on public procurement, taming the risk in public procurement, do you have any nuggets you could share with procurement practitioners to sort of encapsulate the argument regarding risk in public procurement?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd want to say to all practitioners in practitioner land is that it's really, really necessary and important to understand public procurement risk, not for academic or philosophical purposes, but because you want to ensure that you throw resources at the right things in the right way. Let's face it. Right now, the practice in the public sector, and I was in operational procurement at a point, the practice is to view everything as risky. And in viewing everything as risky, right? Oh gosh, my reputation is at risk. If I get this wrong, Auditor General will write me up. Integrity Commissioner will take me out and put me in a prison. There's this view that everything is risky and you're going to go to prison for the smallest thing. No, I would say it's necessary to identify risk appropriately and then throw resources at the risks that need to be managed. And that goes from everything to the size of the document that you use and the type of document. Of course, we at the office have something to do with that as well. To the framing of the criteria, as I sort of mentioned before. There are people who throw the kitchen sink when writing evaluation criteria. Then put everything in there, right? You build a house for some government institution, and the man them ask you how much picnic you have and what color lizard run up and down your yard. It don't make any sense. There are too many things that are entirely burdensome. Mm-hmm. And it's because there isn't a clear understanding of the risk in the implementation. Now, if you understand risk, you can ask better questions that will help you to figure out what things you need to know in order to determine which of the suppliers is the most qualified and the most capable. So, to the practitioners in practitioner land, you really have to understand risk in order to properly deploy evaluation criteria or any other number of discriminating decision-making criteria in public procurement. And I would say that's one of the chief applications of this discussion. I've separately said that one of the legal principles that I think underpins our legislative framework is this thing about proportionality. And it asks a question about necessity. Are you doing the thing that's necessary? Or are you just doing it because somebody else did do it? Are you doing it because you're trying to avoid prison and them someday? I mean, at all costs, avoid prison. Mm-hmm. Don't go. It's not a nice place.
No.
Not a bed of rose.
Not.
But just recognize that it's not every decision that's going to land you in prison. And it's important to identify those decisions that are going to have an impact on your contract outcomes and focus on those. The other things will take care of themselves. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It makes a whole lot of sense. This brings us to the end of an interesting conversation on risk in public procurement. taming risk in the public procurement landscape. It's very important and insightful to note that while there are risks in public procurement, there are opportunities to tame the risk. And so we want to thank Mr. Andrei Bennett for sharing these insights with us. Folks, you can reach out to us via our social media platforms, as well as you can leave a comment below the video. And thank you so much for joining us on this topic, risk in public procurement. Thank you.